Get started with our final session here. My name is Fred Hoff. I'm a senior fellow in the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East of the Atlantic Council. I've had this job for about a year, and the job basically boils down to Syria, which is our topic this afternoon. And I suspect this is very much in keeping with the Atlantic Council's tradition of ending these summits on a supremely high note. Our session this afternoon is on the record. I would ask that when we're finished, please keep your seats so Ambassador Ross Wilson will have an opportunity formally to close the summit. I would also like to mention that General Salim Idris was originally planning to be with us. He is the Chief of Staff of the Supreme Military Council. Unfortunately, he is otherwise occupied fighting a two-front war. We have an excellent panel today that will really, I think, struggle with the question of trying to point a way forward on Syria in terms of strategy. We have Aydin Tashbash of Milliyet. We have Hannes Svoboda of the European Parliament. Sandy Berger, who served as National Security Advisor in the administration of President Clinton, and Steve Hadley, who had the same job for President George W. Bush. Now, Syria today represents several things, I think, none of which, with rare exception, almost none of which are good things. We have a humanitarian catastrophe that is now affecting a number of Syrians that is approaching half of the population, a catastrophe that is swamping Syria's immediate neighbors, including friends and allies of the United States. We have chronic state failure, featuring an emerging, unstable partition between the regime, a longtime state sponsor of terror in the West, and terror itself in the East, in the form of various AlQaeda affiliated organizations which are managing to implant themselves in Syria. And we also have the Kurdish PYD attempting to carve out an autonomous zone along the Turkish border. We have a chemical weapons agreement that is producing, by all accounts, good arms control results, but really not addressing, at least directly, the destabilizing essence of the Syrian problem. And finally, we have a US-led campaign to convene a Geneva peace conference in the hope that a political transition process can start, notwithstanding military advances on the ground by the Assad regime. Now, our panel's mission today is really not to decry the situation, or for that matter, how we got here. President Gaull's words yesterday about the consequences of turning a blind eye to crises far away may suffice in that regard. I'd like to start then with Asla. If you could give us a sense, very briefly, how is Turkey processing current events in Syria, and what, from the point of view of the Turkish leadership, seems to be the way forward?
Thanks, Fred. Of course, I'm supposed to personify General Idris here. So with that in mind, I should point out that I ran into somebody from government, a minister from the government a few weeks ago, and he said, You're like a broken watch, which shows the the actual time, just like a broken watch, showing the actual time twice a day. You criticize us the rest of the year, but then there's always something that comes up in which our policies collide. And Syria does happen to be one subject in which I think I join in the government's, I kind of understand the government's criticism of US policy. I think from the Turkish perspective, it does not look like this is a done deal, in the sense that whenever you talk to US officials now, you get a feeling that, you know, people are acting like Syria is over. You know, it's gone. We reached the chemical agreement with the Russians, and it's, you know, we might as well forget about Syria. It ain't so. It really is not over. It's, the war is continuing. The humanitarian tragedy is continuing. It's, in fact, Syria is not contained. It's destabilizing US allies in the region, Lebanon, quite soon, Jordan, and I will add Turkey. Humanitarian tragedy is at portions we're not really able to deal with, not Turkey, not regional players. I think that Geneva is a fantasy. It's not happening. There's no stick. It's only basically if Assad wants to play a role in Geneva, he will. If he does not want to, there's no mechanism to enforce that he do that. I used to think that, you know, we had, the allies, you know, US had no strategy in Syria, that they should be doing this, that they're behind and everything. I stopped saying that because I do think there's a clear strategy, which is, don't let any side win, let Assad stay in power. Let Assad manage to hold on to power, and let it implode. And this, apart from the moral questions, I do think this is a really risky strategy. Let me add the issue of radicalization, and I know there's a lot of criticism towards Turkey on this, and some of that is valid. We can talk about that later. You know, Turkey has been sloppy in terms of monitoring its border and in terms of realizing the threat from radical groups. Having said that, here we have it. This last week we had General Abdulkadir Saleh in Aleppo die. Every week we're getting news of another moderate commander dying, being killed, mostly by the radical groups, if not the regime. And what we're left with is essentially Al-Qaeda, the two other key radical groups, and with the moderate, relatively moderate opposition, rebel forces, rebel commanders dying. What does it mean for all of us? It's not, you know, the lesson to get out of this, to me, if I was just purely looking at it with a strategic perspective, the lesson I would get is not what people in Washington seem to be thinking, which is, oh my God, there's radicals here, let's stay out of it. I'm thinking, where are these people going to go? 2,000 EU citizens. Al-Qaeda having something, Al-Qaeda, an affiliated group, having something in the vicinity of 30,000, 40,000 men in arms is just a very threatening concept at the heart of Levant. Also, let me add that I somewhat share Turkish concerns about Americans not being too concerned about inviting Russians back into the Levant, for lack of a better term. I don't want to sound like a cold warrior, of course, but it is true that if you want to get anything done in Syria today, you know, you're not going to really make Washington your first trip. You're going to try to go to Moscow and try to convince Putin. Does that not have consequences for all of us? Have we thought through this with allies? I don't think so, because it's very clear to me that the Russians have a plan in the Middle East. I don't think Americans do, but the Russians do have a plan. And that plan has two significant components: reversing US influence in the region, and secondly, it's, you know, don't let Islamists get to power. So, you this could really have a very destabilizing, this whole policy that I laid out, it could have a very destabilizing impact in the region. And on top, let me add that Syria and Egypt together are two cases. We've been telling Islamists in the Middle East all this time, stay within the democratic game, stay within the system. Democracy, if you keep blowing yourself up, it's not a good thing to do. You got to form political parties, play within the parameters of democracy. And all of a sudden, it's just no good. Democracy promotion, I'm not, trying to sell an overheated democracy promotion rhetoric, but on the other hand, we've taken away democracy as an ideal. We're not telling people to strive. We're telling people in Egypt and Syria that it's not something to strive for. We're also telling Islamists that it's not an attainable goal. So as in terms of the West, it not only takes away your moral authority, but it leaves all sorts of questions in terms of what radical Islam and Islamists are going to be striving for in the future. And lastly, I don't know if I'm going over time, but I think that we are really facing a situation in which the regime forces might roll over large parts of territory that rebels have gained control over the past 3 years. And that includes Aleppo. Aleppo is right on our border, and it kind of is like the Benghazi in Libya in the sense that it's a strategic and significant city and a strategic outpost. So if actually 6 months from now, the regime forces do take back Aleppo and are at our border, basically at the border with a NATO country, what do we do and what are the strategic implications? Have we actually resigned to the idea of Bashar Assad taking back his country with little pockets of AlQaeda territory sort of remaining? It's really a scary thought to me, and I don't think there is enough creative and imaginative thinking on that. I have some ideas. I don't want to go over time. I have some ideas in terms of the humanitarian crisis and its impact, but let me end here.
Okay, well, Asla, before you pass the baton, just very quick answer to this. Is it your sense that the essence of Turkish strategy with regard to Syria right now is basically to try to get the United States to change its mind? Is that what it comes down to?
Turkey has overplayed its hands in some sense. Last year this time the rhetoric coming out of Ankara was overconfident. It did not match Turkey's capabilities. We miscalculated, thinking Assad was on his way out 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It was a matter of time, 6 months, 2 months, this summer. We also really miscalculated the threat from radical groups. And I think this, I traveled with Abdullah Gül, Turkish president, to New York for the UN General Assembly this year in September. And it was kind of interesting because everywhere we went, every forum, every meeting, editorial, people got up and criticized Turkey for its support of radical groups. And at the same time, Rouhani was the toast of town. Like he was being wined and dined and waited, and Turkey was being treated as this terrorist state where Iranians were the much-awaited, long-lost cousins. So I think Turks now see the consequences of they're a little bit shy about the language they have used about promoting their Syria policy, and I don't think it's clear that Turkey's support for radical groups has endangered its relationship with the United States. So right now they're sort of waiting to see what will happen.
Okay, thank you very much. Hannes, without suggesting that there's a unanimity of view in Western Europe concerning Syria. I wonder if you could describe for us, in general, how this crisis is being processed in Western Europe and your own sense of the way forward, given the mess we have on our hands right now.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I must confess I'm one of the late invitees, and maybe that I have to rush off because I have another obligation in the same city but far away because it's a big city. Let me say all of us, I would say in the West, Europe and in the United States, have three myths, three illusions. Arab awakening, Arab revolution, somebody is going against Assad, wonderful, support them in some way or the other, and Assad will be away very soon. It's so naive. Look at the effect of the Arab awakening or troubles or whatever Madam Albright, the secretary, said just. The only country which is for the moment relatively stabilized is Morocco, where you had very, very small steps forward, with the king in the lead. In Algeria, nothing happened. It's still, blockade. Libya is a chaos. I was not against intervention, but how can you intervene so silly and don't think what happens afterwards? Where all the weapons are going to Mali. Now we have to intervene in Mali, not thinking about what happens. Tunisia, let's hope in the coming days we will find some sort of solution. And Egypt is not a solution. For the moment, it's a bit stable, but what comes afterwards, nobody knows. And then Syria. Syria is totally different from the other countries. It has been much more multi-religious, not only the Kurdish population, the Christians, and many others who supported Assad because in some way he was keeping their rights, their basic rights. It was not a good regime and became an even worse regime. But the naivety to think there's a revolution and will blow away Assad in few times is very naive. Secondly, Russia. Russia lost. Russia is weak. Just also with a discussion here in one of the rooms upstairs, Russia will be in a big crisis soon. How often did we say Russia will be in a big crisis and will be weak? In the past years. It's still here. It's stronger than before because it plays a role and has certain interest. We all think we have our interest. We have European interest, American interest. Russia doesn't have to have interest. It has interest. It goes in a way and has methods we deeply deplore, internally and externally, but it is here. And we saw it in Syria, and we saw it yesterday with Ukraine. And we are so naive and thought this is all over, we can do it our own way. No, we cannot do it. Russia plays a role. As you said, Russia has a concept. We don't like it, but it has a concept at least and a strategy. And the third naivety, and I want to perhaps to provoke you, is Iran. Or just been one of the spokespeople, the ambassador, Jeffrey said, more or less, Saudi Arabia is our friend, Iran is our enemy. Why? Saudi Arabia is promoting jihad all around the globe, I would say. This is our big friend. Look what Saudi Arabia is doing, for example, together in Pakistan. I had yesterday a long discussion with the father of Malala, the young girl who was attacked. He can tell you in detail what is happening there. So it's for the moment, more people are killed by the support of Saudi Arabia jihadists than people are killed by support of Hezbollah and others. I don't like the Hezbollah, I don't like Iran activities in that sense, but to say the one is the good and the one is the bad, I don't want to turn it around, is very, very naive. I was in Iran two weeks ago, and I deliberately speak, especially with the moderate conservatives like Rafsanjani and Larijani and so on. They know the citizens in Iran want change. They don't accept any more people like Ahmadinejad. They have Ahmadinejad with his strong words against Israel and not delivering. That is out for the moment. And let's give a chance, and I particularly speak about the citizens in Iran and I met many of them, many of the young journalists who are working with reform-oriented media. It's not a democracy yet. Human rights situation is awful. But there is a chance of some change. Now, I don't want the atomic bomb for Iran, because I don't want it for Saudi Arabia. I don't want it for anybody there in the region. There are already too many. But it's not so easy to explain. You know, the two atomic powers, Israel and France, recently when they met in President Hollande and Netanyahu, speak about another potential atomic bomb in the region. It's a bit, you know, morally a bit strange. So yes, we should fight against another atomic bomb. And I said it quite clearly also to the Iran leader, look, if you have one, Saudi Arabia will have one very soon. And what's the end of it? You spend a lot of money on something which will be then challenged by another atomic bomb. I say this because we have to change the whole attitude toward the region. The balance between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others, and of course a strong Israel, is very important to find stability. We cannot solve the Syrian issues so easy in saying away with Assad and another Sunnite radical government, and that's peace. Twice the United States of America, especially in some European countries, helped Iran in the past. Iran didn't do anything, but the US did it and other European partners to get rid of the Taliban, at least in the government. Big victory for Iran, because the Taliban were the enemies. Secondly, Saddam Hussein. We got rid of Saddam Hussein, big victory for Iran. They didn't do anything, but their main enemy has been pushed away. And now we are not clever enough to find a way with Iran to bring him in to a normal political strategy in the whole region. But as we, as the US and as Russia, they want to have some security because they are a regional power. They want to have some security there. I don't want that the Shiite, let's say, community is too big. We already have Iran, we have now part of Iraq. It's good that we have the Kurdistan region there very strong. And we have also to find a situation in Lebanon. But without Iran, we cannot find it. Therefore, my plea, even if that is provocative, hopefully we can find a solution on the nuclear issue, but we have to rebalance. And this fake idea we have, the Iran is permanent enemy forever, and Saudi Arabia is our friend supporting the jihadists all around the region. Look what they do, and Bahrain, you can of course add, what they do in North Africa, how wonderful they are and how peaceful they are. And can you remember, and you know perfectly well, those who are not all too young, when Israel and Iran were good friends, because they wanted to have both a balance against the Palestinians and the Arabs. So the only strategy for Europe, useful strategy, but I think also for the US, is to have a balance of power in that region, and this is the only strategy to come to peace. I don't know if Geneva II will be very soon successful or not, but anyway, Iran should be at the table, as Russia is on the table, and the only chance to find peace. Military, I don't find how you want to find peace. It is naive, has been very naive to do it, and let's hope that Europe can be a bit more sophisticated in the strategy and to help to find peace in the region, and of course that refugees can go back. And for the refugees, on the last word, we had I invited 3 refugees into my political group. I am heading the Social Democrats in European Parliament, and asked them, what do you want? And they said one thing: give us education and training. We want to build up the new country. You don't have to send your experts. We want to be the experts. So don't let the refugees being alone in their camps with radical forces coming in. We have to give them education and training that when they can go back and build up a new Syria. Thank you.
Hannes, thank you very much. Sandy, I think we can probably stipulate that there are no silver bullets or magic formulas or easy solutions here. When you look at this situation. What sorts of things could the West be considering to mitigate this hideous situation? What kinds of things could we be aiming at?
Fred, this is a much harder problem than it was 18 months or even a year ago. Had we strengthened the moderate opposition before the regionalization and radicalization of Syria. In the meantime, the fundamentals on the ground have changed. The opposition is increasingly fractured and extremist, with elements that are fighting now for the greater Islamic State, not for getting rid of Assad. The moderate opposition has less and less purchase over the rebels who are fighting. This war has become increasingly brutal on both sides, and the balance, as others have said, now has shifted in Assad's favor. I think the chemical weapons agreement is good. I mean, it would be a horrible thing if these weapons got in the hands of al-Qaeda if Syria fell apart, but it doesn't change at all the fundamentals on the ground, as far as I see. Fred, I don't see there's no easy road ahead. I give the administration some credit for trying to convene the parties in Geneva. I'm very skeptical that much will come out of that. I see no particular reason why Assad will cede power when he believes that he is winning. I see no particular reason why Russia will lean heavily on Assad and replace him with some unknown general when they have a pretty reliable general sitting there now, leader. The only, and I throw this out as a kind of a wild card here to me, ironically, is Iran. Very knowledgeable people have said to me in the last few weeks that Iran's economy is in dire straits, much worse than we thought. It is not, and which is maybe driving them towards a nuclear agreement with us. It's not inconceivable that this is an expensive operation for them, and they will want some way out. I think that's a wild, wild possibility, but given the horrible choices, it's not something we should totally put out of our minds. So I don't see Geneva leading to a solution now. The alternative is to change the dynamic on the ground. And I think that has an internal piece and an external piece. The internal piece is for the United States to step up significantly its aid to what's left of the moderate opposition. Mostly, I think, in organization and training, some in weapons, although there's a lot of weapons flowing into Syria now. I think the value of that would be to put the United States at the table to help consolidate and coordinate what's going into Syria, because it's now going in a lot of different places. Give us some leverage to focus the Saudi money and the Qatari money, and to stop the self-defeating flow of funds from the Gulf to groups which are going to come back and haunt us and haunt them. It's a lot like Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we funded al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda came back and attacked them and us. And I think unless we're more engaged, it's hard for us to do that. So I think that's the inside part of it. The outside part of it, it seems to me, is the external parties who are supporting the opposition. And I think we need to have an honest conversation among those external parties, including Turkey, about what is a realistic endgame for Syria. It is not all or nothing. No side is going to get it all here. I mean, I think it involves Assad leaving, but it also involves core elements of the government surviving, power sharing, devolution of power, decentralization. And if the outside powers can agree to that, bring Russia into that. There is seems to be some political context which then can be presented to the opposition and ultimately to Assad. And I think the combination of the internal piece and the external piece of that puzzle can provide some way forward. But let's make no mistake, that process is would take 2 more years. And in the meantime, the killing will go on, the death and destruction will go on. But in my view, there will be no military solution to Syria. Ultimately, there's either no solution or a political solution. If there's no political solution, we'll see Syria continue to deteriorate. We'll see one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes since Rwanda get even worse. And this kind of the regional security and humanitarian dimensions of Syria just continue to gnaw at the Middle East.
Thank you. It's interesting in your analysis of the internal factor. It seems that that you've made a link that's quite interesting. The issue in tabloid headline terms is always whether or not the United States should arm the opposition. But you seem to be saying there's an additional element too, that the United States really needs to take charge of the process by which people are armed and funded.
You know, I just came from Saudi Arabia. You know, the Saudis have made a judgment, as they said to me, we're all in. The problem is they're all in, to some degree, for the wrong people. They're very fed up with the United States. They're prepared to commit billions of dollars. At this point, I don't think it's a matter of financing. It's a matter of coordinating what's going in. If we decide that we are going to try to save the moderates, at this point it's almost saving the moderate opposition. It's a function of making sure that that support goes in a sensible way. So I don't think it's so much that we need to buy howitzers. I think we have certain skills in logistics and organization and intelligence, and then pulling all the others together that I think is really the missing link here.
The basic idea being that direct involvement gives us some skin in the game,
right, exactly.
if we're going to try to regulate the activities of others. Steve, it's quite obvious in the context of Syria. There are places where the President of the United States has just not wanted to go. He's been quite skeptical about the utility of the application of American power. It seems that the American experience in Iraq has had an impact on his thinking, the slippery slope and all of that. From your point of view, are there things, given the current situation, the United States and the West generally can consider doing that can make a real difference in the situation without embroiling ourselves in a long-term conflict in the region?
Yeah, I think there are. I think Sandy gave a terrific answer to your question, and I think it's a first draft of a policy. Now, a couple things about that. One, I think the administration is worried about sins of omission, sins of commission. They think the Bush administration's activities in Iraq was one of them, and I think what we're learning is there are sins of commission, but there are also sins of omission. And the failure to be involved here over the last 2.5 years is delivered a disastrous situation. So I think second, I think Sandy has sketched it out. It may seem a little naive. It's certainly hard. It certainly would have been easier 18 months ago. But the problem, of course, is all the alternatives are worse. Assad wins, sending the message to the world that if you are willing to kill hundreds of thousands of your people, the international community will let you stay in power. Terrible lesson. It falls into chaos, which risks destabilizing the whole region. And the opposition winning, I don't even know what that means. But I think what it means is that increasingly the opposition, it means Islamist and Al-Qaeda. So the reason to do and attempt what Sandy's talking about is that all the other alternatives are worse. I think Sandy's got the right framework. I would just add maybe 3 or 4 elaborations. One, I think it is important to get the vision of what an outcome might be out publicly. And we really have not done that. And then secondly, get as many Syrians to support it as we can, and then get the international to support it. And that vision basically is, it's going to be a transition government with elements from the regime that want to be part of the new Syria. That will reassure Christians, Druze, Alawites that there's going to be a group of people in this transition government to protect them, and have the more moderate democratic opposition as part of that government. And that government then will lead a process that will lead to hopefully a stable outcome. I think Sandy's right. Decentralization needs to be part of that, or the country, after all of this, will not stay together. I think we need to put together a very large aid and assistance package so the people of Syria know that if they're willing to make the transition to a new Syria, they're not going to be abandoned, which in fact we did in Libya, but there's actually going to be the international community is going to help them economically to give them some incentive to make this transition. I think we also need to have a heart-to-heart conversation with the Russians, maybe the Iranians as well, and emphasize the Al-Qaeda part. What is happening in northern Syria and in Iraq today is exactly what we fought against and prevented in 2007 and 2008, which is the establishment of a safe haven Al-Qaeda area from which they can destabilize the region. That is what is happening, and that is bad for Turkey, it's bad for Russia, it's bad for the region. And I think if there's one argument I'd be making to everybody else, it is that one. That is the reason to do something. And I think then what they need to do is deliver Assad to the table and then deliver him out of power. I think ultimately it's got to be a negotiated outcome. Ultimately it's Geneva II. You've got to structure positive and negative incentives now so you both get the people to the table and get a reasonable outcome from the table. I think there is some urgency to do it because I think the longer this goes, the more destabilizing it is, the more sectarian it is, the more it turns the Middle East into a war between Shia and Sunni, which is a huge opening for Al-Qaeda. So I think there is some urgency to try to get this off the ground. The only other thing I can think of that the administration will not do, and I'm not sure I would argue for them to do, is if the administration would go to the Russians, for example, and say, we want to do Geneva II, we want to do it in the next 6 months, and you need to help make that come about because we are not prepared to let Syria bleed for the next 2 years. It's too dangerous for what it's going to do to the Middle East. We are on the verge of a sectarian war in the Middle East. And I would have American presidents say to the Russians, we're going to give it 6 months, and if at the end of that, we are going to step in. Think about, that's what got before the deal on the chemical weapons. That does seem to be the one thing that gets the Russians' attention. But you can't bluff if you're the United States, and you can't say you're going to do it and then not do it, and I don't think this administration is willing to do it. And so I think we're playing a very weak hand. But I think there's no alternative then to try to structure these incentives and see if we can, and Sandy's given us a first draft, and see if we can pull something. But we are late.
Thank you, Steve. All of our panelists, one way or the other, have mentioned Russia and Iran here. We've had repeated reports from the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria to the UN Human Rights Council. Balanced reports that have pointed to the depredations of some of these jihadist elements, but reports that have made it clear that the overwhelming quantity of humanitarian outrage has been created by the regime, not only through chemicals, but through daily mass fire attacks on populated areas. Putting aside political transition, do any of you have the sense that Iran and or Russia could be forthcoming in trying to get their client out of some of the worst practices here?
At least my interlocutors in Iran made it very, very clear. It's not about Assad and the regime, it's about, of course, certain influence for the Shiite community and, of course, them. And I think basically that's true of Russia. It's not that they stick to one person or to one regime, and you know that there was also some criticism even from Rafsanjani in the public on Assad. But for them, these figures don't count. What counts is, of course, a certain influence. So if, as Senator Berger said, if you find a solution, and others find a solution of internal peace with the neighbors and certain influences and certain respect for certain influences, or co-sharing, let's say, a solution, I don't think it will keep on Assad. There are elections, I think, next year on the president, and to find a way out that he's no longer running at the election, but that some of the groups he represents and some of the foreign country represents will be in the game, I think that could be the solution.
Thank you. Sandy.
There's no question that the jihadists have perpetrated increasing brutality. But Assad's strategy, fundamental strategy, is calculated misery. His strategy is drain the sea to catch the fish, shell the village to get the people out so he can go after the army by using aerial bombardment, right, Scud missiles. This is, so I don't want to in any way justify what is an increasingly ugly and brutal campaign by the jihadists, but let's not lose sight of the fact that what Assad is doing is, as I say, strategy of calculated misery. To your point about the Russians, I would rather, on September 27th, a few days after the UN approved the chemical weapons agreement, there was a presidential statement out of the Security Council, which Russia, no one signs on to a presidential statement, but they basically agreed to it, calling on Syria to open itself up to humanitarian assistance. And that's where I would put the pressure. I would try to rally the international community, saying, you know, if you can get Assad to give up his chemical weapons, then you can get Assad to open his country to humanitarian assistance. He has not let, I'm on the board of the World Food Program, extraordinary effort going on in Syria, but it does not have complete access to the country, harassment at the border, convoys being hijacked. So it seems to me that's the piece where I would really go after the Russians. Putin, you want to be a world statesman? Okay, let's be a world statesman in terms of the humanitarian issue.
Terrific. Anything else on this before we go to the audience? Steve.
As Sandy suggested, you might actually get Assad to do it because he thinks he's winning, but it's a little obscene. You know, he's actually now winning, and in some sense, humanitarian assistance takes some of the pressure off him because it reduces what you see in the headlines. And I would, you know, I'd be tempted to try to do it, but I'm afraid it a little bit salves our conscience, a little bit like the chemical weapons. It removes a threat to us. This would salve our conscience, but it wouldn't stop the killing, and it wouldn't prevent what's happening in Syria, not only to compound the humanitarian disaster for the Syrian people, but destabilize the region. So that's the fundamental problem, and that's the one we have to focus on.
Okay, thanks. At this point, we'll go to the audience. Please, when you're recognized, identify yourself and be as brief as possible. Right here.
Oda Aberdeen. Regarding the humanitarian suffering by Syrian refugees in Syria, in Turkey, in Jordan, and in Lebanon. And I can't understand why we have not, the international community, have not asked the rich Arabs to put in more money to save those people in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon. I mean, it's easy. These people need medicine, they need tents, they need educational equipment. You could do this by allocating $3 billion.
Thanks. Thanks. Sandy, is this something you took up in Riyadh?
I did. I mean, there is money coming. You know, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others are providing funds, not enough. I mean, World Food Program spends $30 million a day to provide food. Doesn't reach everybody, but that is, I think, only partly a money issue. It's mostly an access issue because the UN agencies have to work through governments. So it's dependent upon the Syrian government giving approval to go into opposition areas where the rebels control it. But I agree with you. This is one of the reasons I went to Saudi Arabia, was to say, listen, you know, you spend billions to give them man pads, you can spend billions to provide more assistance. I couldn't agree with you more.
I suspect that Russia and China are also candidates for getting into this business. Yes, Asla.
Recognize the fact that nobody is talking about changing the balance on the ground, in the sense that people have collectively given up the idea of affecting the outcome of the war.
Well, I think our two former national security advisors have.
I don't think anybody is prepared to see the opposition anybody in the West is prepared to see the opposition win, and I think we should just establish that as a fact.
Which opposition?
Whichever the opposition, people are not prepared to let Assad go.
Mm-hmm.
Provocative as that may be, that's the reality.
Yeah. I think central to what I said was that we should affect the balance on the ground. We should provide aid and more support to the opposition to create a balance on the ground. I don't believe anybody can win this war militarily. I don't even believe Assad. If we didn't give any aid to the opposition, I don't think Assad can prevail, but I certainly don't think that we can provide enough aid to the opposition that it can prevail, but I certainly think we should create a balance on the ground. I thought that was sort of central to what I was saying.
Okay, we have a question here, and then one out in right field there.
Thank you.
Yes.
Olgu Kumush. So I should say that I'm a little bit frustrated. I should say that to the panelists, because now for 1 hour, we are talking about a country in Levant. We said Iraq, Iran, Russia, but we did not pronounce yet the word energy. So I would like to ask the role and what is the impact of energy, oil, and gas in the Syrian crisis? Because as we know, just a few months before the crisis, Syria was preparing Iran-Iraq gas pipeline, and even intending to play a role of oil export port in the Mediterranean. So my question is, what is the role of oil and gas in the Syrian crisis? And is it a more pipeline-stand war than a secular war? Thank you.
Anybody? I'm not aware of pipeline politics having been at the root of the uprising in Syria or the prosecution of the internal war within Syria. Syria's own oil production now has fallen into the hands of certain rebel groups that are self-financing some of their own operations, but beyond that, I'm not aware of this having a kind of a great game aspect. Anybody? Okay.
Well, just in general, I think we have to rethink the whole structure. And of course, with the Kurdistan area in Iraq, and Iraq is such, and Iran, we have to come to a new situation where we have, as I said before, a more balanced situation between the different deliveries. The only alternative is we have to fight. Well, America already has some alternative on the energy issue because of shale gas. We in Europe have a lot to do, especially also what's concerning the LNG and LNG ports we have to build. We have to increase the importance from our point of view and disperse to more different regions in the whole area. But I don't think it's strongly connected with the Syrian crisis. I don't think that.
Thank you, Hannes. Yes, sir, right over here.
Hi, Piotr Zalewski with Time Magazine. I wanted to pick up right where Asli left off. There was news today that 6 of the biggest Islamist rebel groups fighting in Syria have joined forces under a single command, effectively distancing themselves from the FSA and General Idris. These are rebel groups that are said to count, and this is a conservative estimate, 45,000 men. With that in mind, where does that leave the Western-backed opposition, and where does that leave the West? And maybe another question. I mean, since many of our speakers have seen, intelligence on some of the groups that are now operating inside Syria and have been operating inside Iraq, we're talking about Al-Qaeda groups. What is your assessment of the kind of damage that these groups can inflict, not inside Syria, but in neighboring countries, and Turkey in particular? And if there's a Turkish official in the audience who would like to weigh in on that as well, that would be great.
Thank you. Anybody?
It shows, it is a troubling development, and it shows the effect of not having been active to arm and train the more moderate democratic elements. There are some interviews here weeks ago of people who had defected from the Free Syrian Army and joined Islamist groups, and the reason they gave was they're the people who are getting the money and they're the people who have the weapons. And so we're going to affiliate with them. And it's the lack of an alternative. The irony is that everybody's getting weapons in terms of the most extreme elements and the Syrian government, except those people that are probably most attuned to our interests. That's the absurdity of all of this, and we're seeing the effect of it. And I think one other thing I would say, Odie Aberdeen's point, we should be thinking about all the things we can do to prevent this conflict from spreading. And helping with the refugees in neighboring countries is one. Sandy talked about cutting off the flow of money and arms to the jihadis. It is also cutting off the flow of jihadis, and that is something Turkey needs to do more of, because a lot of the flow is coming in through Turkish airports and then across the Turkish border. This is something which Turkey and the United States can be working together on. How to get a strategy of incentives, positive and negative, that will bring this conflict to a close. But secondly, in the interim, how can Turkey and the United States work together to limit its effect on destabilizing the rest of the region? So it's time for Turkey and the United States to reconnect on Syria policy and coming up with a common agenda, because they are two critical countries if we're ever going to get out of this mess.
Thank you, Sandy.
The flow of funds here are affecting the alliances on the ground. So there are many funding streams. Saudi government funds, Saudi private individual flows of money, Qatari, Emiratis, and those flows cause shift of alliances on the ground that are often often back and forth. And it's one of the reasons why it would be, I think, very advantageous to have some kind of consolidation or coordination of what's going into Syria. There may be as many as 2,000 different militia armed opposition groups in Syria, and these alliances shift even battle by battle, town by town. So I think it reflects partly what Steve is saying, which is that's where the military support is, but also where the funding is going.
Our colleague Hannah Svoboda had a meeting across town. I just thought I'd specify that. He was not leaving in protest. I believe we have time for one more question right there. Yes.
Thank you. May I address my question to Stephen and Sandy? The US had a very clear policy vis-à-vis Middle East, North Africa, and Gulf back in 2004-05, Greater Middle East Strategy. But today, when you look at the region, unfortunately, there is so much disappointment with regard to what the US interest and strategy is. There has been a lot of talk about US disengagement from the region in favor of Asian pivot. Then this has been denied, saying that we still have strategic interest, we'll stay in the region. Then what happened in the Gulf with Saudi Arabia, relations getting cooled down, and more cozy relationship with China, Saudis are having, even in Moscow, Prince Bandar was. And then with regard to Egypt also, rightly or wrongly, there is a perception that US betrayed one of his closest allies. And you seem to have a quite warm relationship now with Iran. So this created a trust crisis, confidence crisis in the region, vis-à-vis the intentions of the United States. As one of the panelists said, Russia, Iran, China, they have very clear-cut strategy vis-à-vis the region. And is there a disconnect here, or is there integrated strategy involving Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iran, and Saudi Arabia? Or it is just piecemeal approach? It will be good to hear.
Very good, thank you. Systematic withdrawal from the region, is this what's going on?
I'll give the negative case, and Sandy will clean it up a little bit. I think we have not had a strategic approach to the region. I think we have tended to treat each of these things, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, as a sort of a stovepiped case, crisis to be managed. We have not had a comprehensive strategy that was consistent with American principles. We could talk about that for a long time. The impression it is given is that we're withdrawing from the region and disengaging from the region. And that's why you see, you know, the day after, you see a lot of people talking to Russia now, Egyptians receiving a Russian military delegation. This is unprecedented since the 1970s. It is, so I think what the administration is finding is you could talk about the importance of Asia, but you can't leave the Middle East behind. And I think Secretary Kerry, to his credit, really understands that and has put a lot of energy in the Middle East, and he's right to do so. Oddly enough, an agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue may compound the problem. And I think it may cause some people in the region to conclude, oh, we get it, we know what the American policy is. Assad can go ahead and kill his people as long as he doesn't use chemical weapons, and Iran can have hegemony in the region as long as it doesn't have a nuclear weapon. That's not a good place to be. And so one of the things I've urged the administration is, especially because you've got potential for a resolution with Iran, you've got to pair that with a whole series of other initiatives that shows to the region the United States is going to be present in the Middle East for a long time. We're going to be committed to our alliances over the long time, and we are going to be present. And that means it's important for us to leave a significant troop presence in Afghanistan. It is important for us to re-engage with Iraq and get active in Iraq to help them deal with the al-Qaeda problem. But also it sends the message that Iraq is not going to be now a satellite of Iran. I think it requires us to do some troop deployments. Someone suggested the other day, maybe we home port a carrier in Japan. Maybe we should think about home porting a carrier in the Middle East to make the statement that, hey, we are not leaving. There are a whole host of things we need to do, and part of it is helping do something to bring Syria to an end. So I think the challenge is for us to step back, make it clear to the world we are still engaged with the Middle East, have a more strategic approach, and put some real muscle behind it, because the developments are not positive, and we could be looking, if we're not careful, at a Middle East that is not congenial with our interests over the long term.
And you to my colleague on the left.
I just want to say, in order to send the message across to your friends and allies in the Middle East and your enemies that you're not leaving, you have to not want to leave. So basically...
President Obama is not here to answer that question, but it is
so
the question.
Every signal and every statement that I'm getting is that we can't wait. We can't wait to get the hell out of here. I think it's short-sighted. It's a fantasy. It's not going to happen and all. But unfortunately, that's the tune that we're getting from Washington. And of course, people are questioning U.S. commitment to the Middle East. Best case example is Syria. I disagree with you. I think we're letting Syria bleed. We, I mean you and us and the international community.
I agree with you.
Exactly.
That's what I've been saying.
So, and I think it's shameful, and I think we're going to have to pay a price for it. Not just in our conscience, but also strategically and further down the road in other ways. But again, going back to the Middle East, if everybody is talking about leaving the Middle East, I don't see why people in the Middle East and the Russians and the Iranians have to recalibrate their calculations. I think they feel they're winning. Americans are leaving, and we're settling in.
Thank you. Thank you. Sandy, last word.
A couple observations. Number one, I don't think we're disengaging from the Middle East. President talks about a pivot to Asia. It's hard to pivot when one foot's nailed to the ground. And I think we are nailed to the ground in the Middle East, and I don't think we can afford to pivot. This has been a particularly difficult period over the last 2 to 3 years to manage American foreign policy. The Turkish government has learned how difficult it is to manage foreign policy during the last 2.5 years, has gone in different directions over this period. It's been a difficult time to get your bearings. I have not agreed with every decision, if you've listened over the last hour that the government has made. But I think we are, I think as a country we're committed to the Middle East. I do think Steve makes a good point. I think some of the things that have happened have created real anxieties here, not just in Turkey, but in the Gulf, about our commitment to the region, our policy in the region, particularly if we move forward with an Iranian nuclear agreement, which I think would be, if it's a good agreement, preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which would really destabilize this region, because then the Saudis will get a nuclear weapon, and then the Turks will want a nuclear weapon, and the Emiratis want a nuclear weapon, and the Middle East as a nuclear, with the nuclear arms race is not a terribly attractive prospect, but that'll cause other anxieties. I think we do need to be far more proactive in terms of reassuring the region of our commitment to the future here, to our future here.
Thank you. 2 requests. Number 1, please sit still for Ross Wilson. And number 2, please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific job.
To a close our 2013 Atlantic Council Energy and Economic Summit. I want to thank our panelists here. This was a terrific conversation, I thought. It did a good job of diagnosing the problems. It also did a pretty good job of trying to develop some prescriptions. And I like Steve's reference to Sandy Berger's first draft of a policy framework. I think there's some elements here certainly that those of us at the Atlantic Council that care about this region, and that in particular care about Syria, perhaps can try to work on over the coming days and weeks. I want to thank all of you who are here, as well as our other participants who are not able to make it all the way to this last session, for being part of our event this year. At the opening of the summit on Thursday, we talked about the dramatic changes that are taking place in the region and the world, dramatic changes with respect to Syria and other political aspects around the area, dramatic changes in the energy sphere. We'd heard about that at breakfast this morning from Fatih Birol and Carlos Pascual. Dramatic changes in the economies and in some of the nature of the economic problems and difficulties and opportunities that we heard about from Deputy Prime Minister Ali Babajan last night, and a whole range of other sessions that I hope helped to shed some light for you on what some of those issues are. We certainly hope that the summit also enabled you to establish some contacts, both with old friends, longtime friends who might have been here, but also establish some new relationships that will be helpful for you. We look forward very much to having you with us at the 2014 Atlantic Council Energy and Economic Summit. The dates will be similar to these, tentatively November 2021, the same time frame though. Following immediately after this, we want to invite you to a reception that will take place out in the foyer adjacent to this and the other ballroom. Again, thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking our closing panelists again.
Our work is done.